Shalom, everybody. I want to talk about the book of Jonah. But before I get to Jonah's story, I want to tell you a story of my own, and we'll circle back around. In some serpentine way, we'll manage to get to Jonah eventually. So my story. When I was in the 10th grade English, we had to give oral book reports, a lot of them, about once every 6 or 8 weeks, another oral book report. And I had a classmate named Brad. And when it was time to give our first report, and it was Brad's turn, Brad got up and began like this. The title of my book is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And I don't remember what the rest of his report was. I don't remember the teacher's comments. But the reason I remember that Brad began that way is that 2 months later, when it was time for us to give our second reports, and it was Brad's turn, he stood up and he began like this. The title of my book is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. And again, don't remember the report. I don't remember the teacher's comments or if the teacher even said, hey, wait a second, didn't you? But there's an interesting irony here. The irony is that even though Brad reported on this book twice, I'm pretty sure he didn't read it even once. The reason I think that is that when I look at my copy of Moby Dick here at home, I look at the last page and I look at the number on the bottom of the last page. The number is 687. And I can tell you that the Brad I knew, pretty sure, never read a 687 page book. So if you're Brad and you have to report on the book, twice in fact, and you haven't read it, where do you get your information? This is in the days before the internet, but it's not in the days before this. Sure, you all or many of you recognize that. That's Cliff Notes. That particular Cliff Notes is the Cliff Notes for Romeo and Juliet. I was looking for the Cliff Notes for Moby Dick, couldn't find it. Nonetheless, in honor of Brad, I searched harder and I looked online and I found the Cliff Notes for Moby Dick. I found something interesting in there. Well, let me first give you a quick review of the main plot line of Moby Dick. I'm sure you all know this, but you have a whaling ship captain, Captain Ahab. His ship is called the Pequod. And Captain Ahab spends pretty much the entire book on an obsessive, maniacal pursuit of this rogue whale, this white whale, Moby Dick. Okay, so what I found in Cliff Notes is that, first of all, apparently Captain Ahab stands for something else. The ship, the Pequod, it stands for something else. The whale, Moby Dick, stands for something else. Apparently, in the world of Cliff Notes, things stand for other things. A thing can't just be itself. Maybe a Jewish way of describing this would be to say that in the world of Cliff Notes, they don't believe in pshat. Pshat is a word used in Torah study. It refers to the plain sense, direct, simple meaning of a text, the surface meaning. What they believe in is drash. Drash being another word used in Torah study. It refers to like an indirect or symbolic meaning of a text. Now, I didn't read all of these Cliff Notes, but it's certainly possible, perhaps likely, that if I kept reading, I'd find out that the crew of Pequod also stands for something else. What would they stand for? Well, probably humanity, all of humanity. And that being the case, that would supply Brad, or would have supplied Brad, with a nice conclusion to his book reports. A nice high school book report like conclusion that might go like this. Well, there they were, the crew of the Pequod, all trapped on the ship, and the ship was going down, and they're all going to drown. But who is it that's really going to drown? Isn't it all of us? Okay, well, the reason I told you Brad's story is that there are two ideas in there that we can bring to bear on our understanding of the story of Jonah. The first idea is drowning, and the second is the dual concepts, pshat and drash. Now we need to talk about these concepts a little and sharpen them appropriately for application to understanding the story of Jonah. And let's start with drowning. So let's begin by thinking about the possibility that Brad was right, that all of us, or perhaps many of us, are drowning in some way. Think of it like this. If you consider all of our loves and hates, our happinesses and sadnesses, our sources of good fortune and bad fortune, all that stuff, all those emotions and experiences, they make up what people call the human condition. And though the world of these emotions and experiences is vast and complex, we can't wrap our minds around it. Nonetheless, it circumscribes us all. That stuff circumscribes us all, and in many cases drowns us. So it's that sense of drowning that we're looking for, that sense of drowning that's a kind of window onto the human condition. We need to sharpen that appropriately, size that window, and so forth. And I thought that perhaps a way to do that would be to have a look at Brad's favorite book, Moby Dick. After all, Moby Dick is filled with rough seas and drownings and near drownings. There's got to be something of use in there, but I found that no, I wasn't able to make it work for us. I don't know if it's Melville's language or style or what it is, but that wasn't working. So I thought, all right, let's have a look at another author. And this author is Thomas Wolfe. Well, Thomas Wolfe, you probably know, wrote several fairly fat novels. You Can't Go Home Again, Look Homeward, Angel, The Web and the Rock is another one. And these are, like I said, thick books. They're thicker than Moby Dick. It's a good bet Brad never read them. But Thomas Wolfe also wrote some short stories, one of which is one of my all-time favorites. If you've never read this story, the story is called Only the Dead Know Brooklyn. You've got to read it. You can find it online. Wonderful gem, tour de force little story. It's a story about a man in Brooklyn, and he's the narrator. He's telling the story to us readers. He's telling us about an experience he had one day there in Brooklyn. So I'm going to read a little part of this. Put on my Brooklyn hat and read this in my best Brooklyn accent, such as it is. Don't know if the hat will help. I actually have a Brooklyn hat, as you see. So in this excerpt, I'm going to read the man, this narrator, he's on a subway in Brooklyn, and a stranger just approaches him and starts talking to him. And this short conversation is what I'm going to read. Can you swim? He says, just like that. Sure, I says, can't you? Well, can you swim good? He says. Like a fish, I tells him. I'm a regular fish in the water, I says. What becomes of people after they've drowned out here? He says. Like, you can't drown in Brooklyn, I says. You got to drown somewhere else, like in the ocean where there's water. Drowning, the guy says. Drowning. Well, I could see by then he was some kind of nut. So we was coming to a station. It wasn't my stop, but I got off anyways. Well, so long, Chief, I says. Take it easy now. Drowning, the guy says. Drowning. Okay, that, take off my Brooklyn hat here. That kind of gets at the sense of drowning we're looking for, but we're not quite there. To really nail it, we're going to look at a poem by the English poet Stevie Smith. Now, Stevie Smith had the experience one day of being at the beach. Looking out into the water, a ways out there, there was a swimmer waving to the people on shore. But then Stevie Smith realized, wait a minute, he's not waving, he's drowning. Some of the people on shore swam out, tried to save this man. They were not successful. He drowned, and Stevie Smith wrote a poem about this experience. So let me share the screen so you can see the poem as I read it. Here we are. Nobody heard him, the dead man, but still he lay moaning. I was much further out than you thought, and not waving, but drowning. Poor chap, he always loved larking. Now he's dead. Well, it must have been too cold for him. Well, his heart gave way, they said. Oh, no, 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 it was too cold always. Still the dead one lay moaning. I was much too far out all my life, and not waving, but drowning. That's it. That's the sense of drowning we're looking for. And how is this man drowning? We don't know. Perhaps he was drowning in debt all his life. Perhaps drowning in a failing effort to provide for his family. Well, maybe he was drowning in the loneliness and oppression of life in the big city like Brooklyn. Maybe that was what the guy in the Thomas Wolfe excerpt was talking about. Or maybe he was drowning in the effort it took to keep people from seeing that he was an imposter or thought he was an imposter. Now, this is something we hear a lot about these days, imposter syndrome. It's sort of the syndrome of the day. I don't mean to make light of it. It's certainly a very real and serious thing. So just a final comment about this sharpening of the concept of drowning. Notice that we did this without appealing to any technical definitions or philosophical explanations. We did it just by experiencing literature. I think that's pretty neat. Okay, so let's talk now about the other idea that came up in my story about Brad. The other idea being these dual concepts, shot and drash. And what we want to do is add a little texture and dimension to these concepts. We want to try to extend them to other realms than text study. And if you think about it, I think you'd agree that there's certain ways you could extend these ideas that are, it's pretty simple and straightforward. For example, you could apply shot and drash to an understanding of art or music. In fact, let's Let me share the screen and show you something. Here we are. Okay, so what you see here is a painting called The Human Condition. You may be familiar with it, or if not, perhaps you can guess the artist. It's Rene Magritte, the Belgian, famous mid-20th century Belgian artist, surrealist. And like most of his paintings, at least all the ones I've seen, this one is a little bit unsettling. And it takes you a second to figure out what's so unsettling about it. Now, I don't know what's going on with the bowling ball down on the left there. Or, maybe since this painting is called The Human Condition, maybe that's a cannonball. I don't know. But what's unsettling here is that if you look at the canvas, an artist presumably has looked out that window and painted the same scene that we're looking at. But what's unsettling is the way what's on the canvas is such a perfect continuation of what we see through the window. It's hard to tell where one stops and the other begins. So shortly after he painted this, Magritte made some comments about his painting in general. And I'm going to read those, but in these comments, there are places where he uses the expression overt meaning. And when he says overt meaning, I've substituted the word pshat. And there are places where he says indirect meaning or symbolic meaning. When he does that, I've substituted the word drash. So let me read this to you. Questions such as, what does this picture mean? What does it represent? Are possible only if one is incapable of seeing a picture in all its truth. It's like believing that the drash meaning is worth more than the pshat meaning. There isn't only drash meaning in my paintings. How can anyone enjoy interpreting symbols? They are substitutes that are only useful to a mind that is incapable of knowing the things themselves. A devotee of drash cannot see a bird. He only sees it as a symbol. Well, you can see that he's gotten kind of worked up here, and I'm guessing maybe he's heard just once too often somebody ask him, well, Mr. Magritte, what does this painting really mean? No, really, what does it symbolize? Mr. Magritte would not have been a happy man in my 10th grade English class. In any case, we've just got our feet wet with this little exercise I've walked us through. And I've walked us through this because now we want to try to extend the notions of pshat and drash to a more complicated situation. We want to apply these terms now, not to texts or to art or music, but rather to people, to a certain aspect of people. So let's start like this. Picture an individual with other people, the world, looking at him. And this person puts on his best appearance. He puts his best foot forward. At the same time, he perhaps hides from people things about himself he doesn't want them to perceive, to see, or to hear, whatever. So that is to say, these people perceiving this individual are really perceiving a kind of interpretation of the individual. They don't see the individual for exactly what he is. They see him in a drash sort of way. We can apply the word drash to this because there's an interpretation of the individual. Now flip this all around. imagine an individual looking out at others, other people, other situations, things, looking out at the world. Well, I would bet that most people you talk to, when you ask them about how do you perceive the world, they'll say, well, I see people and situations and things for what they are. I've been around the block. Nobody's pulling the wool over my eyes. I see that person for who he is. I see that situation for what it really is. And you can see that we can reasonably apply the word pshat to this sort of outward perception. So we have pshat in this direction, drash in the other direction. Well, but of course, we realize there are individuals who don't see the world for what it is and realize that, who will tell you, no, I don't really think I see the world objectively. I admit I put a kind of skew on things. So there are people who don't see the world objectively. Now, the famous Israeli behavioral economists, Kahneman and Tversky, Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, they have a theory that goes like this. They would say, well, it's not the case that some people don't see the world objectively. No, it's the case that no one sees the world objectively. You can think of it like this. You talk about a person looking at the world through rose-colored glasses. He looks at the world through rose-colored glasses. Well, what Kahneman and Tversky are saying is that we all have glasses like that. We're all wearing glasses that are tinted in some way, perhaps not rose-colored, maybe some darker, more depressing color. They're beveled in some way. They skew what we see. We don't see the world objectively. I was talking to a friend of mine about this idea of Kahneman and Tversky. She's a retired marketing professor. And she said, Kahneman and Tversky didn't invent this idea. Look, people in marketing and advertising have always known that no one sees the world objectively. It's the job of people in marketing and advertising to realize this and leverage it, take advantage of it for their own benefit or for the benefit of their clients. Well, I don't know. Maybe she's right. Maybe Kahneman and Tversky didn't invent this idea, but I don't think people in marketing and advertising invented it either. Actually, I think it comes from the Talmud. It comes from Talmud Brachot, the tractate Brachot. And there's a discussion in there among the rabbis. They're discussing the possibility or the nature of the prophetic content of dreams. And they're going back and forth. They have different opinions. And one of these rabbis, Rabbi Shmuel ben Nachmani, he's holding his counsel. But finally, he's had enough. He's having none of this. And he says the following. This is the Art Scroll translation. He says, a person is shown in his dream nothing but the products of his own thoughts. And now here's a very loose translation of that same line. And this may be familiar to you. This is a line that's in the air. It's appeared in a number of places. I tried to track down exactly where the origin of this was, but I couldn't find it. Anyway, this loose translation goes like this. We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. Again, a very loose translation, but I think about it. I think you can make it work. So let me just quickly summarize this Tversky-Kahneman idea with a different image, different way of looking at it. imagine that we've all got a pane of glass, maybe the size of a door. We walk around with this thing and we look at the world through this thing, this huge pane of glass. And the world looks back at us. When they look at us, they have to look through this pane of glass. And we have appropriately tinted and beveled and biased this pane of glass, unconsciously pretty much, so that what we see and what they see when they look at us, these things are not objective. It's drash in both directions, according to Kahneman and Tversky. I don't know, maybe they would cringe, but I think that's an image that'll work for us. Now, before we get to Jonah, I just want to observe that this gives us a nice way to understand a well-known statement of Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde, in a letter to a friend, wrote the following. He said, "The world is filled with great mystery, but that mystery does not lie in the things we don't see. It lies in the things we see." And I have to think that that Mr. Wilde was in tune with what Kahneman and Tversky and advertising executives and marketing professors and the Talmud have all been trying to tell us. We do not see things as they are. We see things as we are. Now let's talk about Jonah. When I learned Jonah as a kid, a young kid in Hebrew school, the story was called Jonah and the Whale. And it went like this, just a very quick summary here. I'm sure you all know this story. God commands Jonah to prophesy, make a prophecy in the city of Nineveh. Jonah doesn't want to do that. He runs away. He boards a ship. The crew members on the ship, they find out that Jonah has displeased God, run away from God. They throw him overboard. A whale swallows Jonah. Now, I know that in Hebrew, it's big fish, dag gadol. But I'm thinking that back then they probably thought whales were fish, so I think we're okay. So this whale swallows Jonah, and Jonah's sitting there in the whale. You kind of picture Geppetto and Pinocchio down there with their little campfire, stuck in the whale. And inside the whale, Jonah repents, and then God has the whale spit Jonah out onto dry land. And that's the story as I learned it. Now, this differs from the story you read in the Hebrew Bible and the Tanakh in two major ways. First of all, the story as I learned it is only half of the story of Jonah. The book of Jonah is 4 chapters. They're called chapters, really like 4 paragraphs. The whole book of Jonah is only about 2 or 3 pages. It's 4 chapters, and the little summary I just gave you only covers the first 2 chapters. The other major way that my story differs from the story we read in the Hebrew Bible is that even though the whale kind of had top billing in the story, the way I heard it, you've got to pretty much do that if you want to engage little kids. It's almost like a superhero, this whale. In the actual story, the whale just gets mentioned twice, 2 brief mentions. Once when the whale swallows Jonah, and Jonah's inside the whale, he repents. And then another mention when the whale spits Jonah out onto dry land. So if those first 2 chapters in the actual Hebrew Bible are not sort of obsessed with this whale, what are they obsessed with? Well, what you see in those first 2 chapters is a lot of discussion of rough seas, a ship about to go down, people are going to drown, they're afraid, what do they do about it? Whose fault is it? One of these crew members, one of their gods has probably been displeased. We have to figure out which one, but we don't have time. The seas are getting on and on like this at great length. In other words, you have the notion of drowning, the notion of literal drowning forced into the forefront of your mind when you read the first 2 chapters of the book of Jonah. And therefore, thanks to Stevie Smith, you have placed in somewhere in the back of your mind this particular connotation of drowning that we talked about, this sense of drowning that gives you a window onto the human condition. That's sitting back there in the back of your mind, ready to be applied to the things that happen in the second half of the book of Jonah, the half of the book I didn't read as a kid. And what happens there? Well, it begins kind of like the movie Groundhog Day. God gives Jonah another chance. God says to Jonah again, go to the city of Nineveh and preach to them, proclaim. What God wants Jonah to say to the people in the city of Nineveh is that they've been sinners, they have to change their ways, they have to repent, or a disaster will ensue. This time Jonah has the good sense to do it. He goes to the city of Nineveh, he proclaims, and I'm going to read some quotes from the story. Quote, he proclaims, and the people of Nineveh repent. So, quote, God renounced the punishment that God had planned to bring upon them. And what was Jonah's response to that? Jonah's response to that is, to me, the key, the linchpin to the entire book of Jonah. So I'm going to read it from one of the standard translations, the Jewish Publication Society translation. Their words, but I'm going to read it in a tone of voice that I think will bring out what for me is really going on here. So God renounced the punishment, and Jonah prayed to God, saying, quote, isn't this just what I said when I was still in my own country? That is why I fled before. For I know you're a compassionate God, renouncing punishment. Please, Lord, just take my life. I would rather die than live. Well, that's quite an outburst. First of all, who talks to God like that? And second, Jonah actually didn't say what he says he said. Jonah says, isn't this just what I said? Meaning, isn't this just what I said would happen? No, he didn't say that. You can read the beginning of the book of Jonah and you won't find Jonah saying that. You might say, well, okay, so it wasn't put into the story, but apparently Jonah said it. No, I want to read this story for its pshat value, its surface meaning, what the story says. And if you read the story that way, Jonah did not say that. So has this outburst, he's unhinged. What could cause such a thing? Thinking through what could cause an outburst like this, I think explains the key to the story for us. And let me go through this little explanation in 4 steps. Step 1, the people of Nineveh have repented. They've prayed, they've done sackcloth, cloth and ashes, all the stuff you're supposed to do when you repent. But after the dust settles, after they get back to themselves, get their wits about them again, they're going to start thinking, or many of them will be thinking, perhaps saying out loud, wait a second here. How do we know anything would have happened if we didn't repent? Who is this Jonah guy anyway? He's a snake oil salesman. He's an imposter. Step 2. Jonah's a smart guy. He doesn't always make the best decisions. He's a smart guy. He would realize what's going on in the city of Nineveh. Perhaps he's even heard these rumblings, people talking about, wait a second here, we don't know anything would have happened. Step 3, he hears these accusations. And what would cause an outburst like he had? To my way of thinking, it's most likely that somebody is going to have a reaction like that if deep down they agree with that accusation. They actually think, in this case, Jonah actually thinks deep down he is an imposter. And finally, step 4, we can frame this in a Tversky Kahneman kind of way. Jonah's got his glass wall, and now it's got a crack in it. It's got a break in it. People can see through it. They can, in effect, see the man behind the curtain that you're supposed to pay no attention to. In his mind, Jonah has been found out. Jonah has actually been drowning all his life in 2 ways. One, drowning in the effort it takes people, drowning in the effort it takes him to prevent people from seeing him as an imposter, the imposter he thinks he is. Whether he really is or not, we don't know. But he's also drowning in the fear that someday someone will find this out. Now, I don't know if there are cliff notes for the book of Jonah. Like I said, it's only about 2 pages. The cliff notes would be like 10 times as long as the book itself. But if there were cliff notes for Jonah, they probably would provide a fitting conclusion, a conclusion worthy of my classmate Brad, something like this. There was Jonah with a crack in his glass wall, and all his life he'd been drowning in the fear that someone would see through his glass wall. There'd be a break in his glass wall. But who is it that's really drowning in the fear that someday there'll be a break in their glass wall? Isn't it all of us? Well, I think I've taken this line of thought about as far as I can. So let's leave Jonah, and thank you all for listening.